Hey, if you know us, you know we love talking about horror games here, and often we like to bring up underrated ones, just horror games we don't think get enough love. So we've got 10 horror games we want to talk about today. Some old, some new, that we just think never went mainstream enough, or were great, but just forgotten over time. Let's get started off with number 10, and talk about Visage. This is a title that definitely flew below the radar for a lot of people. It's a psychological horror game, so it messes with your mind a bit. Instead of having you run around shooting zombies or monsters or anything, no, you're stuck in a house that's filled with tragic memories. And as the player, you'll explore a house, reliving a lot of those tragic memories. The home's past occupants haunt the halls, and they'll also, of course, haunt you, following you from room to room, sometimes attacking you, sometimes just making their presence known and spooking you real good. Just like a lot of other horror games, you are left defenseless, which really adds good tension here. This game's creepiest aspect is just how realistic the environments are. Like, it is a very believable setting, and actually seems somewhat comforting at first, until of course, a scary ghost jumps out at you. Seriously though, this one took over Steam for a minute for a reason. Next, over at number 9, let's talk about The Thing. This is a forgotten third-person horror game we try to throw back to and mention whenever we can. It's based on John Carpenter's The Thing movie, just one of the best horror movies ever made. And this serves kind of as like a sequel to it. It's taking place in the aftermath of the events of the film. And the game itself was even endorsed by John Carpenter, who was actually a gamer. Yeah, I'm serious. Look it up. This game is a little bit on the older side. It released in 2002, I think, for PS2, original Xbox, and PC. And it was really ahead of its time in building atmosphere, tension, and grappling with the sanity of your teammates as a gameplay mechanic. The more they would freak out, the more that would potentially go wrong. You know, your teammates could hurt you or themselves in the process. And not to mention the fact that the game was challenging, gory, and gross, as it should be, with a really good, cold, Arctic vibe that they just absolutely nailed. The Thing may have not aged the best, but even back when it released, it didn't get enough love because it was way ahead of its time. Next, over at number 8, Soma is a horror game developed by Frictional Games. You know, the people behind the smash hit Amnesia games? Well, this is their other project, their weirder project, the one that doesn't get brought up enough. Soma was pretty wild. It took the Amnesia hide-and-seek format to a new setting with a cooler focus on story. You're stranded in this underwater research facility, like I'm talking deep in the middle of nowhere, way down in the ocean. And this place is filled with like these horrific robot creatures that believe they are human, but like in a messed up way. It goes deep into sci-fi ideas grappling with machines and consciousness, and the main character Simon's journey really freaking goes places. But it's that dark, gross dread of the horror atmosphere that really works here. Think BioShock, which, I mean, like, that was already pretty spooky, but turned up to 11. There's some puzzles, environment interaction, and lots of sneaking around and hiding from enemies, and the gameplay was fine, but it was really the environment design, the visuals, and the story emphasis that gave you that pit of your stomach spooky feeling. Soma, despite getting a lot of mostly positive reviews, we think is still pretty underrated. It's available for most of the major platforms too. Check it out if you haven't. Next at number 7, Haunting Ground. This game was kind of billed as a spiritual successor to the Clock Tower games, releasing after the big Clock Tower 3. Haunting Grounds is completely forgotten by most. Straight up. It is far from perfect, and it's weird, but it has a small cult following with fond memories. People who've played this game for good reason. This is straight up like a very mid-2000s Capcom-ass Capcom game. Survival horror at its most survival horror-y. You're a girl named Fiona trapped at a castle, and it's up to you to figure out how you got there, what your captors want with you, and survive. And also, of course, solve survival horror style puzzles along the way. The game goes out of its way to really make you feel like this helpless young girl that every creepy monster wants to catch, and it's kind of weird and it might be cringy to some, but it does succeed at what it's trying to do. Even if the game was a little bit dated feeling at the time, you still feel defenseless and vulnerable as these grotesque people and things chase you, and it really amped up the horror factor. Also, there's a cool dog named Huey who helps you out on your journey. I just like that. The atmosphere was good, the music was cool, and there was just some really gross vibes in this game. This was kind of like the last call for games in this like scared girl Japanese horror clock tower subgenre, but it's still worth experiencing if this was your type of thing. Next, over at number 6, we have Among the Sleep, which is a very interesting title where, from a first-person perspective, you play as a 2-year-old who was woken up in the middle of the night, and he climbs out of his crib, and then you kind of go on this weird, surreal, creepy adventure where you're experiencing everything through the eyes of a child who is very confused and doesn't really know much yet. It's really simple, you know, you can crawl, you can grab some things, you can kind of climb, but the game does a good job of showcasing fear in unconventional ways, and it's short and sweet. It's kind of a lot condensed into a small period of time, but it's still worth checking out, especially because now it's available as like this enhanced edition with slightly better graphics. It was a little rough when it first released, but now it's improved, there's more dialogue, there are more moments in the game, and if you're a fan of different horror, some unconventional horror, and we've got a few of those on this list, this is worth checking out. There is a demo available, but really, like, if you were just tired of the same old horror stuff, Among the Sleep might scratch an itch maybe you didn't even know you had. It won a bunch of awards and stuff, but like we never see anyone talk about it in our comments section, so we wanted to highlight it. Next, over at number 5, we have The Suffering. This is a bit of a throwback, releasing on PS2, Xbox, and PC in 2004. You play as Torque, yes, that's his name, an inmate. He's on death row for murdering his wife and kids, and then an earthquake hits the island that the prison is on, which leads to the prison being overrun by creepy supernatural monsters. This is an action game, so, you know, you'll be running around blasting these monsters, and it's kind of like they're all like a physical representation of different execution methods used at the prison, which is kind of messed up and cool. You could also turn into one of these monsters if your insanity meter fills up, which will let you rip through enemies. This game has 3 different endings, all of which are kind of a bummer, honestly. Very grim stuff. And there is a morality system that you have to keep in mind while playing. It can be affected by how you interact with NPCs that you come across, stuff like that. The Suffering is just really interesting and comes from a time when there were some pretty depressing and dark games hitting the mainstream market, more often than they are now. It was very grimdark. It wasn't super scary from like a psychological sense, but just in terms of good old Clive Barker gross horror, they nailed it. Games were just a bit darker in the mid-2000s. Next, at number 4, we have Siren. This is also known as Forbidden Siren in different regions. It's a PlayStation 2 classic, released in 2004 in North America. This is a Sony Interactive published title from creative director and designer Keiichiro Toyama. This is the man behind other beloved titles like Silent Hill and Gravity Rush. Siren, straight up, is dark. You play as multiple characters in a modern Japanese town, and the people involved in the tale have unique powers where they can kind of see what other people see, but like in a weird way. It's hard to explain, but basically the game is always dark, it's always foggy, it's always raining, and it really, really works for building tension and atmosphere. Not to mention the fact that this is a third-person game where the camera is very, very closely and tightly centered on your character, kind of adding a really, really claustrophobic effect to everything. It just is very effective and makes up for the kind of clunky gameplay. But the atmosphere, again, gotta mention, is very much a product of the time. 2002 was when The Ring released and really took North America by storm. This game is very inspired by that, but really the Japanese film that The Ring was based on. Here there's a bunch of cool projection elements and a lot of film grain and texturing that just really adds a good grime and dread to the experience. So despite like the pretty goofy voice acting that might take you out of it here and there, overall the game, playing through it, will give you this like pit of your stomach awful feeling. So if you're looking for that type of horror, definitely consider Siren. Now next, down to number 3, we have Lone Survivor. This is a 2D game, but don't let those 2 dimensions fool you. This game is still genuinely scary. It was like one of the best indie games the year it released, way back in 2012. But still, it's worth mentioning that now there is like a nice director's cut version that's still available that we're obviously highly recommending. So what's cool about Lone Survivor is that it is through and through very much a survival horror game, clearly inspired by the likes of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, where you're very carefully managing very scarce resources. You only have a few things at your disposal. You have to use sparingly. You only have a few bullets to use to fight off these freakish monsters. You have to solve some puzzles, and really, it's challenging, it's engaging, and it's fun if you like these types of games. In this, you are playing as a lone survivor who wakes up, doesn't know where they are, but you're in a post-apocalyptic setting, and you're the only one left, and the game really nails a lonely type of feeling while dashing in some good narrative and, of course, the survival horror elements. And also, your character is hallucinating, so the game will not hesitate to throw some really freaky, grotesque, shocking imagery your way at any period. And it's not just like cheap jump scares, don't get it twisted. The way this game does the gore, does the horror, does the scary imagery, it pulls it off really well, and it sticks with you, and it makes for an unsettling experience, especially considering now we have so many games that are two-dimensional, so many games where you move from left to right, up, down, but Lone Survivor really takes it in a different direction, so to speak, that we highly recommend it still to this day. It made an absolute splash onto the scene when it did release in 2012, but over time, less people know what it is, so we're pointing it out here for you. But down to number 2, if we're talking unique games, we have When the Darkness Comes. This is very much a different type of horror game. Honestly, one up to interpretation, it's essentially an extremely creative experience. It's billed as a walking simulator, but it tries to showcase and illustrate what experiencing depression and anxiety is really like. Now, while it might be too artsy for some, or maybe even too real for some people, myself included, it really does do some dark, interesting things, and the imagery is always eerie or shocking or overwhelming and frightening. They do a really wild job, and it's a hell of an experience. There's some narrative to it, and it's just something that is hellish and horrific, but in a very different way, completely unlike anything on this list, but we here and many others who have played it consider it a horror game. There is a warning attached to this game. The themes are heavy and dark, and the game could also trigger epileptic attacks because it is so visually aggressive. But if you're up for it, you'll play through a very lonely, strange, scary mystery unlike anything you played before. This game has its horror fans for a reason. Now down to number 1, we have Condemned: Criminal Origins, probably one of our favorite games here. It was released as a launch title for Xbox 360, and it's probably the most mainstream game on the list, but it is still one of the most forgotten. This is a first-person horror adventure mystery game with elements of like one of those CSI crime scene cable TV investigator shows mixed with something like David Fincher's Seven, the movie, and also a dash of Silent Hill. You, as an investigator, are hot on the heels of a serial killer, constantly leaving behind gruesome crime scenes, so it's up to you to use your tools like your cell phone, UV light, trying to figure out what's going on here. Also, while you're just making your way through a gross, downtrodden city that is very grim dark, and honestly, what the game does best is nails that feeling of you as an investigator walking into some abandoned building where people live and you are not welcome. Whether it's like a rustling sound in the distance with the good sound design, or maybe you catch a glimpse of somebody running by in the shadows, there's always someone willing to jump out and try and hit you with a baseball bat or a plank of wood, and it's very easy to get murdered in an abandoned apartment building or an abandoned subway station. Basically, what you're doing in this game is making your way from abandoned place to place. There is a supernatural element to it, a psychological horror element to it that the second game kind of really amplifies, but here there's good emphasis on just brutal, simple combat where you're very much squaring off one-on-one with some people, trying to hit them with a 2x4 or a piece of pipe, and it is brutal and it is gross, but the horror elements and like the serial killer elements and the story and narrative and presentation of all of that is really where the game excels, and it is so worth experiencing still to this day. But these are just some horror games that we think people still don't talk about enough. There are so many more though, this list could go on forever, so we want to hear yours in the comments. Let us know some of your favorite forgotten or underrated or unmentioned horror games, and maybe we'll make another list video like this. But if you enjoyed this and maybe you learned about a new game, clicking the like button is the best way you can help us out. We would really appreciate that. And if you're new, consider subscribing, maybe hitting that notification bell, because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.